Folks, you're back with Darren Moore here, sitting in for Jay McNally on the American Dream Talk Show, WHAM 1600 out of Ann Arbor. We are talking with the publisher of the Imaginative Conservative.org, which is really one of, if you want to talk about ivory tower conservatives, if you want to talk about the pre-political world, you've got to go to the Imaginative Conservative.org and read really the great thinkers that gave us this wonderful heritage, this wonderful bequest of wisdom from Michigan's own Russell Kirk, but also other men that we might say are at least partially Michigan men, Orestes Bronson, as well as Albert J. Nock, who as a child was spent a lot of time in Alpena, and then ultimately with the Presbyterian Church in Detroit, a part of the American Mercury. This man that really inspired Russell Kirk, the sage of Mecosta. Russell was the man we've been talking about with Winston Elliott here. Russell is kind of our North Star, so to speak, of the imaginative, contemplative, conservative sort. And so we've been talking about the things that Russell Kirk was a champion of. And one of the things that certainly when we talk about Russell Kirk, we say that he is certainly one of the wisest men, one of the most well-read men. And it was interesting, Winston, you put out the question for what should we talk about on today's show. You said, well, what is wisdom? And can a man be wise without being virtuous? And I just thought that was a really fascinating question.
Well, before we move on to that, I just want to remind you that, of course, you have who I consider to be the most likely person to who represent or step into Dr. Kirk's shoes in our current generation there in Michigan, Dr. Brad Birzer at Hillsdale College, who holds the Russell Kirk Chair in American Studies at Hillsdale College, is just a wonderful Kirk scholar who's written a number of books on J.R.R. Tolkien, on Christopher Dawson.
Oh, that book on Dawson is wonderful. I love his book on Christopher Dawson. Christopher Dawson, by the way, is the man who kind of gave us the idea of meta-history. And Christopher Dawson was this wonderful Christian humanist, but also a historian that was able to really help, in many regards, shape the thinking of Russell Kirk and help him really understand how America is really kind of this full flourishing of this long climb of Western civilization from Jerusalem and the Grecians through Rome, through Christendom, through all of that European civilization, through London, and ultimately into Philadelphia, and how what our founders founded in Philadelphia was really just kind of the next step of man's long climb from the swamp to the stars. And so Christopher Dawson is this wonderful thinker who is really starting to gain a lot of traction, in part due to this fantastic book that your good friend, Dr. Brad Birzer, who holds the Russell Kirk Chair at Hillsdale College, wrote. But he also wrote this great book on James Carroll, one of the more overlooked but certainly sagacious founders from Maryland, the only Catholic signer of the Declaration. Isn't that right?
Yes, that's correct. Yes, that's a fantastic book on Charles Carroll that was published by the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and then his book on sanctifying myth on J.R.R. Tolkien is a beautiful book looking at the religious, spiritual, and intellectual themes that are so important throughout the writing of Professor Tolkien. So, yes, I would highly recommend to your listeners that they take the opportunity to look into these books by Brad Birzer. He also is a writer for the Imaginative Conservative, so if they go to our site, they can just click on his name and see all the wonderful essays by Brad. And what we try to do on the site, of course, is mix kind of the classical, if you haven't read this, you need to, kind of conservative pieces that I go back 50 or 100 years, for instance, when we're using some of the writings of Edmund Burke, who was also a very important influence on Dr. Kirk, to someone like Irving Babbitt, who was a professor at Harvard in the 20s and 30s, to Christopher Dawson and T.S. Elliott, up to Russell Kirk, and then the current scholars who follow in that tradition, like Brad Birzer, like Leaves Whitney, who's at Grand Valley University there in Michigan, Ben Lockard, who's also at Grand Valley, who just did a wonderful program for us on T.S. Eliot's conservatism, and also on the beauty and the moral imagination, which we just put up.
Oh, I love that column. I had no idea that Ben had such a great understanding of not only, I mean, Ben's written on T.S. Eliot, but boy, what a brilliant exposition he did of what is really the beautiful and the good, and do they relate to one another. And so very exciting stuff there. If you're interested in something deeper than what you're typically going to get from Fox News Channel or on your daily radio shows, the Imaginative Conservative is a great place to go. ImaginativeConservative.org. We're talking with Winston Elliott here on the American Dream radio show. You know, you and I are this great admirer of Russell Kirk, and in his, you know, I say that I am merely the latest dust jacket for the great books. You know, my job is to distill down these books for the guy that's out there on the front lines. And one of the books that I thought was really good, and I think this is very interesting, it's the only book I brought with me today, is the book by Russell Kirk called Rights and Duties. It was originally published in 1990 as a series of essays called Our Conservative Constitution. And don't you find, Winston, that today, when the Tea Party that has become this wonderful movement towards the restoration of our Constitution, that the point that Kirk makes, that, you know, the Constitution of itself, although it's a great great document which it sets up the form the way we should make our laws, does not really tell us, though, what should those laws be, but rather restricts and limits the power of the government. And in this book, Rights and Duties, he really does a great job that, don't you think, would be a wonderful book for the folks to read today that are on the front lines of the Tea Party movement, that are really trying to renew the constitutional principles.
Yes, it's a wonderful book, a great collection of his essays on the American founding, on the Constitution, drawing from writers like John Dickinson and John Randolph of Roanoke and John Marshall and others of that period in the early Republic, when not only were they taking this document, and we have to, as you alluded to it, we have to recognize that the Constitution, it was a working document. It was put together in a process of trying to establish a new functioning government. It was not primarily a philosophical statement. It wasn't a statement of high principles. It was a statement of how do a people who want a limited government, want a republic, how do they establish a government that is both respectful of the power of the people, individuals as citizens, respectful of the states because they respected the proper function of the states, but also provide a federal government that would do those things that the states, that people could not do for themselves. And they had a very limited view of what that would be. And it seems to me that the people in the Tea Party have really done a good job of re-emphasizing that we have this document that is our guideline. It's really our set of rules for how should the national government interact with the state governments, which interacts with the rights of the people and the local authorities and communities. And thank goodness that the people like Rand Paul and Mike Lee and some of these others have, in politics, along with the folks in the Tea Party movement, have said, wait a minute, we've got a constitution here. Why don't we look at that before we start talking about the functions of the national government? I was at an event yesterday for a good friend of mine, Ted Cruz, who's running for the U.S. Senate here in Texas, and someone asked him about what departments of the federal government would he do away with, and he said, well, how about if we look at the Constitution and see what functions have been given the national government, and then look at the departments, do away with the ones that clearly are not described in the Constitution. Now, that might be a controversial statement. You don't have to agree with Ted on what departments he would do away with, but you do, I think, have to agree as a reasonable person that it is important to get the document itself when trying to determine what government should do. And Dr. Kirk did that both as a document, but also as an outcome of a community of people, a community of citizens who have a particular ethos in terms of being self-responsible, that the primary responsibility is going to be at the local level with the individual, with the family, and with the local community. And the state and national governments are really meant to do only those things that are necessary, not everything that people should be doing themselves.
We're talking to Winston Elliott here. We'll be right back on the other side of this break.